Rowena had learned to live without a name that felt like her own. The one they gave her at the mission, Mabel, sat on her like a coat belonging to someone else. Functional enough, not quite right through the shoulders. She wore it anyway. What else was there to do? Reverend Cass at the Harrow Creek mission house said she'd been found walking the old Drummond road in late April of last year, barefoot, wearing a man's coat that wasn't hers, unable to say who she was or where she'd come from. He said one of the mission volunteers, a Métis woman named Suzette, had recognized the signs. Exposure, malnourishment, eyes that tracked the world without fully belonging to it, and brought her in before the last of the cold finished what it had started. That was 14 months ago. Rowena remembered none of it. What she had was this: the weight of prairie wind, the specific smell of wood smoke from green poplar, the way dough felt under her palms when she needed it, muscle knowledge that arrived before thought, like her hands had a separate and more reliable memory than the rest of her. She had a melody that came without invitation, soft, looping, with a rise at the seventh beat and a small hesitation at the turn. She hummed it without knowing why. When Reverend Cass heard it once in the kitchen corridor, he'd gone quiet in a way she didn't know how to read. She didn't ask him to explain. She'd stopped asking questions that had no answers, and that had brought her something close to steadiness, though she would not have called it peace. On the morning everything changed, she was sweeping the boarding house steps with the particular attention she gave to ordinary tasks, enough focus to keep the rest of her quiet. It was the middle of May, that specific prairie spring morning, when the sky is so blue it looks painted, and the mud hasn't dried yet, and the air smells like possibility that hasn't decided what it wants to be. Main Street in Harrow Creek was busy with the Saturday crowd. Farmers and their families in from the outer claims, horses standing patient at the rail. She heard the wagon before she saw it. A man pulled up across the street, tall, somewhere in his late 30s, the kind of lean that came from work rather than habit, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days, and the particular set of someone who moved through the world, expecting it to be difficult and not being surprised when it was. He had a girl with him, 7 or 8 years old, red gold hair in 2 braids that had already started coming undone. He tied the team, said something to the girl without looking at her, and started toward the dry goods store. The girl didn't follow. She stood beside the wagon and stared directly at Rowena. Rowena had been humming. She realized it a half second after the girl went still, the melody arriving the way it always did without permission. She let the broom slow in her hands. The girl crossed the street. She stopped 2 feet away and looked up at Rowena with dark eyes that were doing something complicated. Not fear, not exactly recognition. Something more like the feeling of a word on the tip of the tongue, the shape of it present, the sound of it not yet there. "Where did you learn that?" the girl said. Rowena looked at her. "Learn what?" "That song." The girl's voice was careful, precise. "You're humming Mama's song." Rowena didn't know what to say to that. She was still thinking about it when the boots appeared at the edge of her vision, and she looked up to find the man standing behind the girl, his face gone a particular color, not pale, not flushed, but something between the two. The color of a person who has just had the ground shift under their feet and is waiting to find out if it will hold. "Sir," Rowena said. She startled me. I didn't mean to upset her. "Where did you learn that melody?" His voice was level in the way of a man who had learned to make his voice level around the things that mattered most. "I don't know," Rowena said. "The truth as usual. I hum it. I can't tell you where it comes from." He crouched, brought himself to her height, and she saw in his face something that scared her more than anything had in 14 months. Not a threat, but the specific expression of a man looking at something he had decided to stop believing in, and finding he was wrong. He said very quietly, "Can I see your right hand?" She didn't know why she showed him. She just did. The burn scar ran along the base of her palm and the inside of her 3 middle fingers. Old, smooth, pale. She'd had it when Suzette found her. She'd assumed it was part of whatever had happened. He looked at it for a long time. "You got that from the oil lamp," he said. "You knocked it off the kitchen table in November. 2 years before the fire. You were trying to catch it before it hit the floor." Rowena said nothing. Something was happening inside her chest that had no name she could use yet. "My name is Lachlan Drummond," the man said, "and I think you are my wife." The mission's reverend confirmed what he could and no more. Lachlan sat across from Reverend Cass and asked every question he had. Rowena sat on the bench outside the office and listened to the wind move through the cottonwoods and tried to locate the feeling that had arrived in her chest when the man had named the scar. It wasn't memory. She was careful about calling it that. Memory would mean something specific, a picture, a sound, a sequence. What she had was more like a pressure. The way a tooth ached before you knew it was going to hurt. Something pushing from the inside, not yet through the surface. The girl, Tess, came and sat beside her on the bench without asking. She was carrying a small notebook. She didn't open it. She just sat there, close enough that Rowena could feel the warmth of her. You used to braid my hair, Tess said after a while, not accusing, just placing a fact down between them. Rowena didn't answer. You used to do it in 3 parts instead of 2, Tess said, because you said it stayed neater longer, and I had enough to manage in a day without adding loose braids. She paused. I still do it that way. Rowena looked at the girl's hair, the 2 braids already unraveling at the ends. They told you that, Rowena said carefully. Someone told you that's how I did it. Papa doesn't know how to do hair, Tess said simply. I figured it out from the mirror and from what I remembered. She looked up. Nobody told me. The ranch was 3 miles south of town, down a road that turned from packed dirt to 2 tracks through grass as it approached the property line. Rowena had agreed to come without fully deciding to. She would examine that later, the specific way her feet had moved toward Lachlan's wagon ahead of her deliberate mind. She rode in the wagon bed. Tess sat beside her, not pressed against her, not demanding, just present, the way a child was present when they had made a private decision that the adult hadn't caught up to yet. She pointed out things as they passed, the hawk circling the coulee to the west, the place where the creek bent, and you could sometimes see deer in the morning. When the farmhouse appeared around the long curve of the road, Rowena gripped the side of the wagon. It wasn't the house that did it, it was the birch tree. A single leaning birch beside the front porch, its trunk white in the afternoon light, tilted west at an angle that was not quite alarming and not quite ordinary. Old tilt, she thought, before she'd thought anything else. That tree has been leaning since before they put the porch in. She didn't know how she knew that. She didn't say it out loud. She watched the tree as the wagon slowed and filed it away with the growing collection of things that arrived before she had words for them. The farmhouse was rebuilt. She understood this without being told, the wood too fresh in certain rooms, the layout approximating something older. 2 years ago, the original house had caught fire in the night, fast and wind-driven, and Rowena, the Rowena who had existed before, had been presumed gone with it. Lachlan had found evidence later that she'd made it to the creek. He'd searched for 4 days. A spring storm made the water impassable. By the time it cleared, there was nothing. 14 months later, a Métis woman had found a barefoot woman on the Drummond road, wearing a coat that wasn't hers, walking north with no particular destination and no particular name. Rowena learned all of this from outside, through other people's accounts, assembling what she'd lived the way you assembled a quilt from scraps that didn't fully match. What came from inside was different. It came in the kitchen 3 days into her stay when she reached without thinking for the second drawer from the left. Not the first, not the third, and found the bread knife. Lachlan, standing at the window with his coffee cup, watched her do it and said nothing. She heard him set the cup down with the particular gentleness of a man trying not to make a sound. It came in the garden, where she found herself crouching beside a small patch of mint, growing wild along the south fence, rubbing a leaf between her fingers. The smell hit her somewhere she couldn't locate anatomically. Not quite a memory, more the shape of one. She'd planted this, she thought, the spring of the first year, because it kept the kitchen smelling like something other than grease and cold. She stood up too fast, had to grip the fence rail. Tess's voice behind her. You all right? Yes, then I planted this, didn't I? Tess looked at the mint. Mama brought a cutting from the mission garden when she first arrived. Said she'd had her own at home. A pause. I don't know where home was before here. Rowena looked at the mint for a long moment. Neither did she, but she knew the smell of it. She knew it, like she knew the lean of the birch tree and the second drawer from the left. Whatever had been taken from her had not been thorough enough to take this. Sterling Price arrived on a Thursday in June with a man from his office and an expression Rowena recognized without being able to place. The expression of a person who had decided their own interests were the same as the public interest, and was comfortable with that conclusion. He had been, according to Lachlan's hired man Tate, making approaches on the Drummond land for going on 2 years. Good pasture, creek access. Lachlan had declined twice. The third approach was apparently this one. Price did not come to the door. He stood at the gate and waited for Lachlan to come down, and then he spoke at some length about community responsibility and the importance of legal clarity in matters of domestic circumstance, and the particular dangers of an unstable situation with a child in the house. Rowena watched from the kitchen window. Something moved through her that was not confused. Everything else in her life for 14 months had been confused. She was used to that, had made a kind of home in it. This was not that. This was the specific cold clarity of someone who has had a great deal taken from her and has learned to recognize the shape of loss before it fully arrives. She went to the door. She walked out onto the porch and looked at Sterling Price until he noticed her, and then she said, "I'm told you're interested in this land." Price looked at her the way men like him looked at women who were inconvenient. "I'm interested in the legal clarity of the situation here, for the community's sake." "The community's sake," she said. "Right." She held his gaze a moment longer. "You should speak with Mr. Drummond's solicitor." Then she went back inside. Tess, sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook, looked up. "Was that the man who wants Papa's land?" "That's the man," Rowena said. Tess looked back at her notebook. "You're not afraid of him?" "Not particularly," Rowena said. Tess nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. The night before the hearing, Rowena sat at the kitchen table after Tess had gone to bed, and Lachlan sat across from her with his hands around a cold coffee cup. And she told him the things she'd been carrying since the memory arrived 2 weeks prior, in the form of a specific image, herself, sitting on the edge of a bed in the old house, writing a letter she didn't know how to finish. "Before the fire," she said, "I had something to tell you I hadn't told you yet." She looked at the table. "I was waiting for the right evening." He was very still. "I was expecting," she said, "about 2 months along. I'd written you a letter because I couldn't quite find the words out loud. I'd hidden it under the loose board beneath the kitchen window on the south wall. I was going to tell you that week." She stopped, steadied herself the way she steadied herself through most things, with the specific deliberate discipline of someone who had been surviving alone for a long time and had learned that control was the only reliable tool she had. "The baby didn't survive. Whatever happened to me in those weeks, I don't have all of it back yet. But I know I was carrying, and I know the letter is still there." The kitchen was very quiet. Lachlan's hands were flat on the table. "The loose board," he said, "under the kitchen window." "Yes." He didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was even the way it was even about most things, except it cost him more than usual. "Brennan needs to know about the letter." "I know," she said. "I'll tell him in the morning." She looked at the window. Outside, the prairie night was enormous and still. The birch tree's leaves moved in a wind she couldn't hear from inside. "I'm sorry," she said. "About the baby, I'm sorry you didn't know." "Don't," he said. She looked at him. "Don't apologize for what was done to you," he said. It came out quiet and final, in a way that meant he'd been thinking about it, and had arrived at that conclusion a long time ago. She nodded. They sat there until the lamp burned low, not talking, and it was the least alone Rowena had felt in 14 months, which was information she held carefully, not yet ready to put a name to it, but unwilling to set it down. The magistrate's hearing was held in the back room of the town hall because the courthouse was being repaired. It held perhaps 40 people, and on the morning of the 24th of July it held more than that, because Harrow Creek was not a large town, and this was something worth showing up to see. Rowena sat beside Brennan and looked at the room once to take stock of it, the way she took stock of most things now, quickly without revealing what she'd seen, and then looked forward. Price's counsel was precise and organized. An unknown woman, no documented identity, residing in a property that stood to benefit substantially from the claim she was making. Circumstances consistent with fraud. He said none of it cruelly. He didn't need to. Brennan's response was shorter and more specific. The burn scar and its origin. The location of the bread knife, the birch tree's tilt, the mint in the garden, the barn latch, which required a quarter turn before it would release, a quirk Rowena had described before entering the barn for the first time in 14 months, which Tate confirmed was accurate and had been that way since the original construction. Then Brennan asked Rowena about the letter. She told the hearing room what she'd told him the morning before. The loose board under the kitchen window on the south wall of the rebuilt house, where the original kitchen had stood. She had written a letter she'd never sent. She could describe its contents, her handwriting, the specific phrase she'd used in the second paragraph, because she'd crossed out 3 attempts before landing on it. The things she'd been trying to tell her husband before the fire took the house and the spring flood took the road and the weeks after took everything else. The magistrate sent his deputy to the Drummond property. The hearing recessed for 2 hours. When the deputy came back, he placed a sealed envelope on the magistrate's table. The wax was broken from age and weathering, but the paper was there, dry and intact under the floorboard where nothing had disturbed it. The magistrate read it. He set it down and looked at the room with the expression of a man who had no further questions. The legal standing of Rowena Drummond, wife of Lachlan Drummond, was confirmed that afternoon without ceremony. Price's petition was dismissed. The magistrate noted for the record that it had been poorly founded and that its bringing had caused unnecessary distress to a woman still in the process of recovery. Price did not look at her on the way out. Outside the town hall in the flat light of a late July afternoon, Tess found Rowena before Lachlan did. She didn't run. She walked the way she did everything, with that particular 7-year-old dignity that had more to it than most adults recognized, and she took Rowena's hand with both of hers and held it. Not squeezing, not pulling, just holding, the way you held something you'd been keeping a place for. Rowena looked down at her. "I knew," Tess said. Matter of fact, the way she said most things. "I know you did," Rowena said. Papa needed more convincing. Most people do. Tess considered this seriously. That's not a flaw. He just needed evidence. I already had it. What evidence? Rowena asked. Tess looked up at her. The song, she said. You didn't know you were singing it. That's the most true kind of remembering there is. When you don't even know you're doing it. Rowena looked at the girl, the red gold braids and the dark eyes, and the particular composure of a child who had been waiting without being diminished by the wait, and felt something unlock inside her that had been held shut a long time. She didn't have all of herself back yet. She was not certain she ever would entirely. Some of what had happened in the years between the fire and the Drummond Road was still dark water, present below a certain point, not yet surfaced. She wasn't sure the woman she was now was identical to the woman who had arrived in Harrow Creek with a mint cutting from the mission garden, and everything still ahead of her. Time like that changed the shape of a person, the way a river changed the shape of a bank, gradual and thorough and permanent. But she knew the birch tree. She knew the bread knife and the barn latch and the mint. She knew the song she'd hummed without knowing she was humming it, and she knew the notebook Tess carried with pictures drawn from memory that looked like her, because they were her. She knew Tess's hand in hers. Lachlan came out of the town hall and stopped at the top of the steps. Something moved through his face that he made no particular effort to control. He came down the steps without hurrying and stood in front of her, and he looked at her with the same expression he'd had outside the mission boarding house. Except now there was nothing left in it of uncertainty. Come home, he said. She looked at him. She looked at Tess. She looked at the road south, the one that ran 3 miles through prairie grass to a property with a leaning birch and a patch of mint and a loose board that had kept a secret under a kitchen floor for 2 years, waiting for the only person who knew to look. Yes, Rowena said. And she meant it.